The twisted remains of the Tangamundabridge stretched across the Elbe River like broken teeth. May 4, 1945, marked the beginning of something unprecedented. Steel beams hung at impossible angles. Concrete chunks balanced precariously over rushing water below. What had once been a modern engineering marvel now served as humanity's last desperate crossing point. German forces had destroyed their own bridge on April 12th. The demolition was supposed to slow American advancement. Instead, it created the only pathway for salvation. Thousands upon thousands of souls would depend on this shattered lifeline. The irony was not lost on anyone watching the endless procession. Groaning sounds echoed across the water as weight pressed down on damaged supports. Every step threatened to send the entire structure tumbling into the river. Yet people kept coming. The alternative was far worse than the risk of drowning. American intelligence operators in the 102nd Infantry Division sector had been monitoring radio chatter for weeks. What they discovered changed everything. Wehrmacht units were abandoning defensive positions across the entire Eastern Front. This wasn't tactical withdrawal. This was mass exodus. Captain William Patterson lowered his field glasses with trembling hands. The scope of what he was witnessing defied comprehension. An endless river of humanity flowed toward their positions. Military vehicles mixed with civilian carts. Uniformed soldiers walked alongside elderly farmers. Children who should have been in school carried rifles taller than themselves. Patterson had been studying military movements since D-Day. Nothing in his experience prepared him for this sight. These weren't beaten armies fleeing in panic. These were organized forces making calculated decisions about survival. The difference was crucial. 2 weeks earlier, American forces had established positions along the western bank of the Elbe. The Yalta agreements dictated exactly where they would stop. Soviet allies would handle everything to the east. That political decision now carried life and death consequences for millions of people. Allied planners had anticipated German resistance. They had prepared for fierce fighting as Nazi forces made their final stand. What nobody expected was voluntary surrender on this scale. Military doctrine covered combat operations. It didn't address processing entire populations seeking refuge. Intelligence reports painted an extraordinary picture of organizational collapse. Wehrmacht forces weren't simply retreating from superior firepower. They were actively destroying their own equipment when it slowed movement. Elite units were fighting through SS blocking detachments sent to stop them. The most disciplined military machine in Europe was dissolving before their eyes. The destination was clear to everyone involved. American lines represented survival. Soviet capture meant probable death. German military intelligence had intercepted communications revealing projected casualty rates that turned strategic calculation into simple mathematics of existence. Statistical projections showed devastating clarity. Every 100 German soldiers captured by Red Army forces meant fewer than 40 would survive to return home. The actual numbers would prove even more catastrophic than these estimates. Knowledge of these statistics spread through German ranks with terrifying speed. Beyond immediate military considerations lay a broader humanitarian disaster. 8 million German civilians were fleeing westward from territories now under Soviet control. East Prussia had become a killing field. Silesia was emptying of its population. Pomerania's roads were clogged with refugee columns stretching to the horizon. Behind these desperate masses came Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front. Accompanying them was Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front. Together, they represented overwhelming military superiority, crushing the last organized German resistance. The mathematics of warfare had become hopeless for German defenders. Soviet superiority reached ratios of 20 divisions for every German division still combat effective. The advance was covering 30 kilometers every single day. Weather conditions were improving. Supply lines were secure. Nothing could stop the eastward momentum except the Elbe River and American positions. Refugee columns managed only 10 kilometers on good days. Elderly people couldn't maintain faster pace. Children needed frequent rest stops. Wounded soldiers required assistance from comrades. The gap between pursuit and pursued was closing with mathematical precision. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic assessment would later be captured among German military documents. The directive was underlined for emphasis. Maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This represented recognition of fundamental reality rather than military defeatism. Surrender to American forces offered reasonable probability of survival. Capture by Soviet forces meant probable death through execution, starvation, disease, or brutal labor conditions. The choice was stark and undeniable. German commanders were gambling everything on a single observation about American character and military procedure. Yalta agreements had determined occupation zones with precise geographical boundaries. American forces had halted at the Elbe River exactly as promised to their Soviet allies. German units reaching that river before Soviet forces arrived from the east would enter American custody under international law. The race wasn't for military victory or negotiated peace terms. It was for basic human survival. American forces holding Western Bank positions possessed logistical capabilities that would prove crucial in coming weeks. Each infantry division included attached military police battalions trained in prisoner processing. Field kitchens could feed 15,000 personnel daily. Mobile medical units carried full surgical capabilities. Supply stockpiles reflected American industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. Major James Morrison served as operations officer for the 102nd Infantry Division. He had studied mass surrender logistics following the Ruhr pocket operation in mid-April. That operation had processed 325,000 German prisoners in organized fashion. Morrison's calculations revealed sobering mathematical realities behind humanitarian operations. Processing 1,000 prisoners required 3 tons of food daily. Water needs reached 5,000 gallons per day. Medical screening for typhus and dysentery was mandatory. Delousing stations needed constant operation. Administrative documentation generated 12 separate forms for each individual processed. These weren't abstract numbers, but practical requirements separating order from chaos. Geneva Convention mandated specific caloric intakes for prisoner populations. Working prisoners required 2,200 calories daily. Non-working prisoners needed 2,000 calories. These legal requirements would determine whether mass surrender became orderly transition or humanitarian catastrophe. American supply capabilities would be tested to their absolute limits. German forces approaching the Elbe represented the full spectrum of military dissolution. Elite Waffen SS units still possessed operational Tiger tanks and sophisticated communication equipment. Their training remained excellent despite deteriorating strategic situation. These forces could still conduct effective combat operations if they chose resistance over surrender. Regular army divisions had been reduced to battalion strength through months of attrition. They carried only personal weapons and basic equipment. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Yet military discipline remained intact among professional soldiers. Volkssturm units presented the most heartbreaking sight. Boys as young as 14 served alongside men over 60 years old. Their equipment consisted of armbands and obsolete rifles from World War I. Training was minimal. Combat effectiveness was negligible. They represented desperate attempts to continue resistance with whatever human material remained available. Behind combat forces came auxiliary services representing the depth of German military organization. Construction battalions had built fortifications across occupied Europe. Luftwaffe ground crews serviced aircraft that no longer existed. Kriegsmarine personnel came from ports that had been destroyed or abandoned. Female auxiliary staff faced particular dangers if captured by advancing Soviet forces. Intelligence analysis placed total German forces east of the Elbe at approximately 1.2 million personnel as of April 25, 1945. These numbers included every category of military and civilian personnel still under German control. The breakdown revealed the scope of the approaching crisis. Organized combat units numbered 300,000 personnel with actual fighting capability. Support personnel totaled 400,000, including logistics, medical and administrative staff. Scattered Wehrmacht and Volkssturm members already fleeing westward numbered 500,000. Each category presented different challenges for American processing capabilities. Movement rates determined who would survive the race to American lines. Soviet mechanized spearheads could advance 50 kilometers daily under current conditions. Spring weather was improving road conditions. Fuel supplies were adequate. Resistance was collapsing ahead of their advance. German units on foot managed 30 kilometers under optimal conditions. Optimal conditions rarely existed. Roads were crowded with civilian refugees. Bridges had been destroyed. Food was scarce. Wounded soldiers slowed entire columns. The window for escape was measured in hours rather than days or weeks. April 20th, 1945, brought the first major indication that German strategy was shifting from resistance to survival. General Walter Wenck received direct orders from Hitler to attack toward Berlin with his 12th Army. The order was clear and unambiguous. Wenck made a decision that would save hundreds of thousands of lives. Rather than waste his forces in futile assault against Soviet encirclement of Berlin, Wenck chose to use his army holding open escape corridors to American lines. At his headquarters near Belzig, the general gathered his senior commanders for a meeting that would change everything. Wenck's announcement was simple and devastating. The war was lost. Military reality could no longer be denied. Their duty was no longer to a dead ideology, but to living people depending on them. Soldiers under their command deserved chances for survival. Civilians in their sector needed protection during withdrawal. They would attack westward toward American positions rather than eastward toward certain death. This decision wasn't cowardice, but calculated humanity based on military intelligence assessments. Colonel Gunther Reichhelm served as Wenck's intelligence officer. His compiled statistics from Soviet-occupied territories painted horrifying pictures of what awaited German populations under Red Army control. East Prussia alone had seen an estimated 300,000 civilian deaths during Soviet advance. These deaths resulted from combat operations, exposure to harsh weather, revenge killings by advancing forces, and systematic assault against female populations. Applied to populations now trapped between Elbe River and advancing Soviet forces, these statistical ratios suggested potential casualties in the millions. April 24th brought first reports from American observation posts of extraordinary scenes developing across their front. German vehicles were approaching Elbe positions without tactical spacing. Headlights blazed in direct violation of basic combat principles. Military columns moved in parade formation rather than combat dispersion. These weren't beaten rebels fleeing in panic. These were organized military forces choosing captivity over continued resistance. Their officers maintained military bearing even in defeat. Unit flags were displayed proudly. Equipment was organized and accounted for. The distinction was crucial for processing and subsequent treatment under international law. Captain Robert Thornton commanded Reconnaissance Company of 2nd Armored Division. His radio report to division headquarters captured the unprecedented nature of developing situation. German forces approaching American positions were not attacking or preparing defensive positions. Instead, they displayed white flags and actively requested surrender terms. Within hours, the initial trickle became a human flood that threatened to overwhelm American administrative capabilities. Ninth Army processed 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th. Numbers jumped to 7,000 on April 25th. April 26th saw 15,000 German personnel seeking American captivity. The exponential increase suggested much larger numbers were approaching. These weren't combat captures resulting from successful American attacks. These were deliberate surrenders by military units still possessing ammunition and fighting capability. Many units could have continued resistance for weeks if they had chosen that option. Instead, they chose survival through capitulation to American forces. The Ruhr Pocket surrender in April had established crucial precedent for current developments. Field Marshal Walter Model had dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender his forces to American commanders. Without direct orders to surrender, 325,000 German troops had given themselves up individually to American forces over several days. Treatment received by Ruhr Pocket prisoners had spread through Wehrmacht communication channels with extraordinary speed. Food was provided according to Geneva Convention standards. Medical care was available for wounded prisoners. Protection was offered from revenge-seeking displaced persons and concentration camp survivors. News of humane treatment traveled faster than official communications. Radio intercepts by American Signals Intelligence revealed remarkable conversations between scattered German units still fighting on Eastern Front. April 27th brought transmission from commander of 3rd Panzer Corps that would be repeated countless times in following days. Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided immediately. Food distribution confirmed adequate. That final point about food carried special significance for German forces operating on starvation rations for weeks. Psychological impact was immediate and profound throughout remaining Wehrmacht units. Soldiers who had fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching American lines before Soviet forces could capture them. Sergeant Wilhelm Becker of 21st Panzer Division would later provide testimony capturing the transformation in German military thinking. They had heard Americans fed prisoners adequately, provided necessary medical care, and didn't shoot wounded personnel. After years of total war, such humanity seemed impossible to believe, yet entire units were racing toward it. Reaching American lines required surviving a deadly gauntlet that claimed thousands of lives. SS blocking detachments had received orders to execute any soldier retreating without proper authorization. Military police units established checkpoints on all roads leading westward. Their mission was turning back or shooting defeatists attempting to flee their posts. SS forces remained fanatically loyal even as the Reich collapsed around them. They viewed surrender as betrayal rather than reasonable survival strategy. Blocking detachments were positioned to prevent exactly the kind of mass movement now developing toward American lines. Confrontations were inevitable and brutal. The dissolution began gradually, then accelerated into chaos. Complete military divisions simply vanished as individual soldiers made personal survival decisions. Each man weighed his options: stay and face the advancing Soviet forces, or flee west toward uncertain American captivity. The choice was obvious to most. The damaged Tangamundabridge crossing point worked around the clock. Makeshift repairs kept it functional despite structural damage. Artillery shells had torn through the support beams. Wooden planks covered gaping holes in the roadway. Yet somehow vehicles and pedestrians continued moving across. Even when Soviet artillery shells began landing within range on May 6th, the human stream never stopped. Explosions echoed across the water. Smoke drifted over the crossing. Shrapnel whistled overhead. Still they came. Soldiers, civilians, anyone who could reach the bridge. American officers faced an unprecedented situation. Their own artillery units received orders to fire counter-battery missions, target the Soviet guns threatening the crossing, protect the Germans trying to surrender. It created one of warfare's most bizarre scenarios. Americans shooting at Soviets to help Germans cross safely. Former enemies cooperating while technically still at war. The irony was lost on no one present. History would struggle to categorize these actions. At exactly 02:41 hours on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl put pen to paper in Reims. Germany's unconditional surrender was official. The ceasefire would begin at 2301 hours on May 8th. Every German soldier now had precisely 45 hours to reach American lines. The clock was ticking. The greatest race against time in military history had officially begun. What unfolded next defied every military manual ever written. This wasn't retreat in any traditional sense. It wasn't organized surrender either. It was human migration under arms. Desperate people moving en masse toward salvation. Intelligence estimates put 250,000 German military personnel east of the Elbe on May 7th. Within those crucial 45 hours, approximately 180,000 would successfully reach American positions. The mathematics were stark. Those who made it lived. Those who didn't faced Soviet captivity. The consequences of that captivity would prove devastating beyond imagination. General Wenck's final military operation exemplified honor in the face of certain defeat. His 12th Army maintained its corridor with extraordinary determination. The general positioned his remaining forces with tactical precision. Every tank that still functioned, every artillery piece with ammunition, every soldier capable of fighting. Their mission was simple: hold the Soviets back while the exodus continued. Allow the remnants of the Ninth Army to escape. Protect hundreds of thousands of civilians fleeing westward. Wenck's men understood they were sacrificing themselves for others. The German general issued his final order at 1800 hours on May 7th. His words were carefully chosen. The 12th Army has fulfilled its last duty. We have saved all we could save. Every commander is now free to seek safety for his men. It wasn't surrender in the traditional military sense. It was release from duty. A final gift to his soldiers. The freedom to make their own choices about survival. Wenck himself practiced what he preached. He was among the very last to cross the Elbe. The time was 0200 hours on May 8th. Just 21 hours remained before the ceasefire. He walked across a damaged railroad bridge near Tangamundabridge. Behind him, Soviet tanks were already moving into positions his men had abandoned. The numbers told the story of his success and sacrifice. Of his original 200,000 men, approximately 100,000 reached American lines safely. An estimated 250,000 civilians owed their lives to his defiance of Hitler's orders. The Führer had demanded a fight to the death. Wenck chose life instead. Individual stories revealed the human dimension of this desperation. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann made a calculated decision. He climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter for the last time. Fuel was nearly exhausted. He flew west until the engine died. The crash landing came in an American-occupied field. His aircraft was destroyed. He was injured, but alive. Better to risk death in a crash than face Soviet territory on foot. The gamble paid off with his life. U-boat commander Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock faced different challenges. He sailed his submarine up the Elbe as far as possible. Navigation was treacherous in the shallow river. When progress became impossible, he made a command decision. Scuttle the boat. Lead the crew overland to American lines. The submarine disappeared beneath the muddy water. His men began walking west. They carried nothing but hope. A Wehrmacht doctor faced perhaps the most difficult choice. His patients were severely wounded. Moving them meant death. Staying with them meant Soviet captivity. He chose his patients over his freedom. Someone must care for those who cannot flee, he told departing colleagues. His sacrifice ensured wounded German soldiers received medical attention. Even in defeat, duty mattered. A teenage soldier demonstrated similar selflessness. The overcrowded truck had one remaining space. An elderly civilian needed help reaching American lines. The young man gave up his seat without hesitation. Then he began walking the 100 kilometers alone. He arrived 18 hours after the official ceasefire. Technically too late for guaranteed protection, but sympathetic American guards accepted him anyway. Humanity trumped regulations in that moment. The Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine Meadow camps, became collection points for this human flood. These temporary enclosures were hastily constructed prisoner facilities. Often, they were just agricultural fields surrounded by barbed wire. By May 15th, they held over 1 million German prisoners. Conditions were harsh, but survivable. That distinction would prove crucial compared to Soviet facilities. Prisoners initially had no shelter except holes they dug in the muddy ground. Rain turned the camps into swamps. Sun baked the earth into dust. Food was basic military rations. Initially, 200 calories daily per prisoner. As supply lines improved, portions increased. Water came from nearby rivers through temporary pipeline systems. Engineers worked around the clock installing basic infrastructure. Sanitation was primitive at best. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions. Dysentery was common. Typhus outbreaks required quarantine measures. Yet the death rate remained below 1%. This compared to 35% or higher in Soviet camps. Colonel James Foster commanded Camp Remagen and faced extraordinary challenges. The facility was designed for 100,000 prisoners maximum. By May 12th, it held 184,000 human beings. The overcrowding was dangerous but manageable. We had SS generals standing next to communist prisoners, Foster later recalled, Hitler Youth teenagers beside Stalingrad veterans, female auxiliaries requiring separate facilities for their safety, naval personnel who'd never seen ground combat before. It was controlled chaos every single day. But we maintained order somehow. We kept them alive. That was the mission. That was what mattered most. Processing revealed the Wehrmacht's complete collapse. Some units arrived with documentation intact. Complete rosters allowed accurate record-keeping. Others had no identification beyond remembered names and ranks. Personal papers had been lost or destroyed. Entire command structures had simply vanished. The once mighty 16th Panzer Division arrived with 312 men. Their authorized strength was 14,000 soldiers. Where were the missing 13,688 men? Dead, captured, or scattered to the winds. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division consisted of 89 elderly men. Classification proved nearly impossible for American administrators. Were Hitler Youth members, soldiers, or children? Should they be prosecuted or rehabilitated? Were female auxiliaries military personnel or civilians? What about the Volkssturm Home Guard units? Were they legitimate combatants or pressed civilians? American authorities generally chose humanitarian interpretations. Process everyone as prisoners of war. Guarantee Geneva Convention protections. Err on the side of mercy rather than revenge. What German forces fled from became horrifically clear as Soviet-occupied territories revealed their grim reality. NKVD documents declassified after 1991 confirmed that German fears were completely justified. Of approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by Soviet forces, at least 1.1 million died in captivity. The death rate in 1945 to 1946 exceeded 50% in many Soviet camps. The causes were multiple and interconnected like a web of suffering. Soviet logistics could barely supply their own forces adequately. Feeding millions of prisoners was nearly impossible. German prisoners received 600 to 800 calories daily, far below survival requirements for forced labor. Starvation was systematic. Medical care was virtually non-existent in most facilities. Typhus spread unchecked through cramped barracks. Dysentery killed thousands. Tuberculosis flourished in unsanitary conditions. Siberian winter temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Prisoners lacked adequate clothing or shelter. Frostbite was common. Hypothermia claimed lives daily. But beyond material deprivation was systematic brutality as policy. Soviet guards, many having lost families to German atrocities, showed little mercy or compassion. Prisoners worked in uranium mines without radiation protection. Logging camps imposed impossible quotas. Construction projects ignored basic safety measures entirely. The wounded and sick were often shot as useless mouths to feed. Former Soviet officer Viktor Astafiev later wrote candidly about the systematic cruelty. We were told every dead German was payment for our suffering. Payment for Leningrad. Payment for Stalingrad. Payment for 27 million Soviet dead. Guards competed to see who could work prisoners to death fastest. To show mercy was to betray our fallen comrades. The competition was unofficial, but real. Cruelty became a badge of loyalty to the communist state. The statistics revealed the entire horrific story in stark mathematical terms. American records documented that of 3.8 million German prisoners in Western custody, approximately 137,000 died, a death rate of just 3.6% overall. Most deaths occurred from wounds received before capture. Others died from disease in the war's chaotic final weeks. By June 1945, the death rate in American camps had stabilized at 0.15% monthly. Basic medical care was available. Food was adequate. Shelter was provided. By contrast, Soviet records revealed catastrophe even in official figures. Soviet authorities acknowledged 356,700 German prisoner deaths in their custody. But German research organizations indicate the true number exceeded 1 million easily. The Soviet figures were deliberately understated for political reasons. The Mashka Commission documented that of prisoners taken in 1945, fewer than 50% survived to see 1950. The differential was even starker for specific groups within the German military structure. Waffen-SS members had approximately a 20% survival rate in Soviet camps. In American custody, 95% survived. Female auxiliaries faced systematic sexual assault in Soviet custody. Many were executed outright. Americans generally released them within months of processing. Hitler Youth teenagers were often executed immediately by Soviet forces. They were considered fascist fanatics requiring elimination. Americans processed them as juvenile prisoners requiring rehabilitation rather than punishment. The contrast was absolute between the two approaches to handling defeated enemies. The mass surrender to American forces in 1945 had profound consequences for post-war Europe's development. American and British forces controlled the majority of surviving German military personnel. This provided crucial intelligence advantages as the Cold War tensions began. Operation Paperclip succeeded partly because technical personnel had deliberately surrendered to Americans. Wernher von Braun's rocket development team traveled 500 kilometers through collapsing German lines. Their specific goal was reaching American forces safely. "We despise the French, fear the Soviets, don't believe the British can afford us," von Braun told colleagues. That leaves the Americans as our best option. His strategic decision would eventually put Americans on the moon decades later. The demographic impact was equally significant for Germany's future development. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania lost virtually their entire male population of military age, killed in combat, fled westward, or disappeared forever in Soviet captivity. Entire family bloodlines were extinguished in those regions. The German Democratic Republic would struggle for decades with severe gender imbalance. The loss of so many men created social problems lasting generations. The psychological impact resonated through German families for decades. Families divided by the inner German border often traced their separation to those desperate days in May 1945. Some members had reached American lines successfully. Others remained trapped in Soviet occupation zones. The arbitrary nature of survival haunted survivors. Your fate was determined by which army's uniform accepted your surrender. This became a defining trauma of German post-war collective memory. By 2301 hours on May 8, 1945, when the ceasefire officially took effect, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German military prisoners. This massive influx occurred in just 3 weeks. The 102nd Infantry Division alone accepted surrender of 313,000 enemy soldiers. More than the entire German army that had invaded Poland in September 1939. The final tallies staggered contemporary military observers completely. The U.S. Ninth Army reported processing 423,000 prisoners between April 20th and May 8th alone. The First Army processed another 387,000 during the same period. Statistical analysis showed fewer than 20,000 were actually taken in combat situations. The remainder surrendered voluntarily, often fighting through their own lines to reach American positions. The Wehrmacht was actively seeking American captivity. General Omar Bradley later reflected on this unprecedented situation. "We prepared for victory, not for this mass surrender," he wrote. The German army didn't just surrender in the traditional sense, it dissolved completely. Men who'd fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching our lines safely. They knew what we learned later through bitter experience. Surrender to us meant probable life. Capture by Soviets meant probable death. The knowledge drove their desperate flight westward. The numbers continued growing even after the official ceasefire took effect. Between May 8th and May 31st, another 874,000 German military personnel managed to reach Western Allied lines. They came from Soviet-controlled areas through escape, administrative confusion, or sympathetic interpretation of deadlines. American and British forces often chose humanitarian flexibility over strict adherence to agreements. Individual stories revealed the human dimension behind these massive statistics. Corporal Friedrich Müller surrendered at Tangamundabridge on May 5th. He kept a detailed diary throughout his captivity period. "First day without fear in 6 years," he wrote. "Americans gave us bread. Real bread, not sawdust. A guard offered me a cigarette. I cried openly. After what we did to their people, Why do they treat us as humans? Nurse Hildegard Schneider crossed the Elbe with a military hospital unit. We had 300 wounded soldiers, she recalled. Americans took them all, even the SS men. American doctors operated through the night saving German lives. One told me, "The war's over. Now we're just doctors, and you're just patients." I couldn't believe such mercy existed. Wehrmacht. Private Hans Bauer was only 17 years old. Later he testified about his experience. "I'd been told Americans would torture prisoners. That surrender meant dishonor and shame. Instead, they gave me chocolate immediately. I hadn't seen chocolate in 3 years. A medic treated my infected wound with real medicine. An officer asked if I could contact my mother. They treated me not as an enemy, but as a boy who'd been forced to fight." Former SS officer Wilhelm Hartung expected immediate execution upon capture. Instead, he received medical treatment for his wounds and eventual release. "I deserved no mercy whatsoever," he admitted. "My unit had committed terrible acts against civilians. Yet Americans treated me according to international law, not revenge. That mercy haunted me more than any punishment could have. It forced me to confront what we had become." General Walter Wenck survived the war, living until 1982. In a 1975 interview, he reflected thoughtfully on those desperate final days. "I disobeyed Hitler's direct orders and would do so again," he stated firmly. "My duty wasn't to a dead ideology, but to living men under my command. Every soldier we got across the Elbe was a victory. Every civilian saved was a triumph. We lost the war completely, but in those last days we saved what could be saved: human lives." Wenck never expressed regret for his defiance of orders. "Hitler ordered us to sacrifice ourselves for his Guter Reich fantasy. I chose instead to save my men for their families, for Germany's future reconstruction. Between honor and humanity, I chose humanity. History can judge whether I was right. His actions directly saved an estimated 250,000 soldiers and civilians from Soviet captivity." Many survivors and their descendants still gather annually on May 8th. They honor Wenck's memory and difficult choices. They call him the general who chose life over death, mercy over ideology. The mass German surrender to American forces in April and May 1945 represented far more than simple military capitulation. It was simultaneously a massive humanitarian crisis, an ideological collapse, and ultimately a testament to mercy's power in warfare's darkest moments. The event challenged traditional historical narratives about warfare's conclusion. German forces didn't simply stop fighting when officially ordered. They actively sought American captivity as their salvation. The disciplined Wehrmacht of 1940 had become a desperate mass by 1945. They were willing to risk everything to avoid Soviet retribution. For American forces, the experience proved personally transformative. Young soldiers who'd fought across Europe suddenly found themselves saving enemies. These were men who days before had been trying to kill them. The professional handling of this crisis, despite overwhelming numbers and logistical nightmares, demonstrated American organizational capability and fundamental humanity. Military historian John Keegan later wrote extensively about this phenomenon. The German flight to American lines in 1945 was unprecedented in military history, he observed. Never before had such massive numbers deliberately sought specific captivity, while still capable of organized resistance. It demonstrated that even in total war, human calculations of mercy versus revenge could override ideology and direct orders. The last German soldier to cross at Tangamundabridge was Volkssturm member Heinrich Fischer, age 63. He reached American lines at 2247 hours on May 8, 1945, exactly 14 minutes before the ceasefire took effect. When American officers asked why he'd risked everything to cross, he answered simply, "I wanted to see my grandchildren again." He did see them again. Millions who failed to reach American lines did not. Private First Class Joseph Martinez helped process surrendering Germans at multiple locations. He provided perhaps the most profound observation about the entire experience. They weren't really surrendering to us in the traditional sense, he noted. They were fleeing from something worse than death. We just happened to represent survival. Any one of us might have done the same in their position. That's what made it so human. The desperate German flight to American lines in 1945 revealed fundamental truths about warfare and human nature. Even in humanity's most devastating conflict, the difference between mercy and revenge could be measured simply. Which uniform received your surrender determined everything. For millions of Germans in April and May 1945, that difference was literally everything. The choice between American and Soviet captivity wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about survival itself in its most basic form. The statistical evidence was mathematically overwhelming and undeniable. Surrender to Americans meant 96.4% probability of survival. Capture by Soviets meant fewer than 65% would ever return home. Behind these cold percentages lay individual tragedies and triumphs that would shape families, communities, and entire nations for generations. But beyond statistics lay a deeper truth about human nature. The American response to this unprecedented crisis demonstrated something important: feeding enemies, treating wounded soldiers, maintaining order despite overwhelming numbers. These actions showed that even in total war's aftermath, humanity could prevail over vengeance. Young American soldiers, many having lost close friends to German weapons, chose duty and decency over personal revenge. The damaged crossing at Tangamundabridge became more than a simple bridge over the Elbe River. It was a passage between life and death, between mercy and retribution, between Western and Soviet interpretations of victory. Those who crossed it successfully before May 8, 1945, generally survived to rebuild their lives and their shattered country. Those who didn't cross faced years of suffering in Soviet camps, if they survived at all. The mass surrender also demonstrated war's ultimate historical irony. The Wehrmacht, which had begun the conflict as conquerors seeking Lebensraum in the east, ended it as refugees fleeing desperately westward. The master race ideology collapsed into desperate individuals seeking only personal survival. The Thousand-Year Reich lasted exactly 12 years. It ended with its soldiers racing to surrender to armies they'd once dismissed as decadent democracies. For historians, the event raises profound moral questions. Was American acceptance of these surrenders a humanitarian triumph, or a violation of inter-allied agreements? Did saving German soldiers from Soviet captivity serve justice, or did it subvert it? The answers remain debated among scholars today, but the human impact was undeniably positive. The legacy echoes still in international relations. German-American relations in the post-war period were profoundly influenced by this mercy shown in victory. West Germany's integration into NATO was smoother. Its development as a democratic state was faster. Its role as America's key European ally during the Cold War was strengthened. All were influenced by memories of American humanity in victory. The last crossing of the Elbe was not merely the end of a war. It was the largest gamble on human mercy in military history. A desperate bet by defeated enemies that their conquerors would choose humanity over vengeance. For those who made it across successfully, it was a gamble that paid off with the only currency that ultimately mattered: their lives, and through them, the future of a nation that would rise from total destruction, a nation that would become a cornerstone of European democracy. The damaged bridge at Tangamundabridge, where so many crossed from death to life, was never rebuilt after the war. But its memory endures as a monument to one of warfare's most fundamental truths. In the end, the measure of victory is not in enemies destroyed. It lies in lives saved, not in vengeance taken, but in mercy shown. That is the final lesson of the German flight to American lines in 1945. Even in history's most devastating conflict, humanity could prevail over hatred. Mercy could triumph over revenge. Life could be chosen over death. For the hundreds of thousands who crossed the Elbe in those desperate days, that choice made all the difference between survival and destruction. Their crossing was not just an escape from Soviet retribution. It was a passage from the old world of total war and racial hatred. It was movement toward the possibility of a new world, a world built on international law, mercy, and human dignity. That so many risked everything to reach American lines was not just a military phenomenon. It was a profound human testament to mercy's power in victory. The story ends where it began, at a damaged bridge over the Elbe River, where desperate enemies became grateful prisoners, where American soldiers became unlikely saviors, where the simple act of accepting surrender became an affirmation of humanity's capacity for mercy, even in its darkest hour. That is the lasting legacy of those desperate days in May 1945. Proof that even in total war's aftermath, the choice between mercy and revenge could determine individual fates. It could shape the future of nations. It could influence the judgment of history itself.